everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. Listen up, because the time has come for a new episode of Rock and Read. Today we'll pick up where we left off with chapter 15 of My Effin Life by Geddy Lee. For the past few days, I've been dealing with a runny nose, cough, and sore throat, so please, cut me some slack. Here we go. After a farewell to Kings was done, we returned to North America, leaving me precious few days with my new wife. Really? I don't know how she coped, for as we embarked on what we dubbed the Drive Till You Die tour, the more our record sales improved, and the more our homes were disappearing in the rearview mirror. First, we took a cross-Canada trip as fully fledged headliners, then traversed the USA for runs of 10 shows in a row, then 18, then 11, at which point UFO joined the lineup. That band, and particularly the bassist Pete Way, loved to take the piss out of our songs. One night, the dry ice we had shrouded the stage with during Xanadu dissipated, to reveal a pair of fluffy bedroom slippers stuck to the floor beside my bass pedals, complementing, I guess, my kimono. They had also snuck on stage and placed a miniature Mickey Mouse drum kit in front of Neil's Titanic one. My prog rock inclinations bugged Pete to bits. As I was listening to Bill Bruford's first solo album, Feels Good to Me, in the RV to pass time before a show, Pete stormed on board and implored me to turn off the tape. Clee, please, turn it off. Don't listen to that stuff. Don't do it. It's no good for you, mate. We all indulged together in the occasional line of Shana, but more than that, UFO really loved to drink. Or four. When we played at Texas, they couldn't get their heads around the situation and grew visibly upset. Right before they were due to go on, I happened to glance out the dressing room window and saw them in full stage gear with their tour manager in the parking lot, gathered around the open trunk of his car, swigging from bottles. At least once on that tour, I'd be backstage listening to them play and hear a kerplunk followed by the absence of bass. Pete had fallen off the stage again. I didn't see him for many years after that tour. Then in the 2000s, he showed up backstage in Columbus, Ohio, with his latest wife, Jo, on his arm. She was an accomplished doctor, apparently, and seemed like a lovely person, yet he looked unhappy, and the worse for wear. In February '78, we returned to the UK for the second time in little over a year. We were excited about it, but had to learn to adjust. We had been spoiled by the ease of touring in America, where the venues were mostly new with large and easily accessible loading docks, spacious backstage areas, and clean dressing rooms, the whole shebang fully equipped and powered up to run any amount of gear or effects you brought with you. It was not the same in the UK back then, with its smaller, older, often crumbling venues. We were still learning about the effect that different voltages and step-down transformers had on the sound of our amplified instruments, and we'd have to load in down back alleys, set up in cramped and drafty dressing room spaces, especially in the winter, where there was little to no central heating, and cope with thick fire curtains that were required to be dropped between acts, which affected where you could place your gear, as well as strict safety regulations that constrained incendiary FX. We weren't using a ton of pyro yet, just one or two flash pots for 2112 and some dry ice for Xanadu. Lasers would only come into play in the La Villa Strangito period, when Howard developed that magnificent fanning out effect over the audience. Inspired from a young age by Chet Monk's work with the Rolling Stones and Arthur Max's with Pink Floyd, which he felt added a dramatic, even emotional dimension to shows at a time when few rock and roll acts thought in truly theatrical terms. Hearns always went the whole 9 yards. We didn't object, except when what he wanted was way too expensive, and even then, I'd often fight Ray on his behalf because I really believed in developing the show. But even in our earliest, humblest days, when we had no money and were struggling to build our own show, we were spoiled by his imaginative use of limited resources. He made magic with liquid lights, a la Grateful Dead, unusual gels, and just a few PAR cans, the kind of light with a direct, narrow beam, originally used on roads and the landing strips of airports. Hearns was one of the first lighting designers to make full use of them in a concert setting. His first special effect, if you like. Most bands preferred a broad beam bathing the whole stage in a celestial glow and covering the musicians with changing colors. That's how you make a star look larger than life. But Hearns didn't care so much for that. He liked the dramatic dark spaces between the beams and the effect created by crisscrossing them kaleidoscopically above us. And he'd make sure there was always lots of smoke in the air because that made the beams even starker and eye-catching. Our egos weren't threatened by that. We were happy to have a light show at all. Bless his heart, there was a bit of a God complex going on there. Dancing at his console and sweeping his arms in the air, conducting the lights like, "Let there be lights, for I am Hearns, bringer of lights, and I will perform for you tonight. Also, sharing the stage with me are 3 members of a band called Rush. I will make sure that you can always see them as well as my show." To the degree that we could afford, we also started creating little animated moments. On the Fly-By-Night tour, we projected an image of the owl from the LP cover that flapped its wings, which wasn't all that sophisticated, but went down a treat. We used rear screen projections from the earliest days and became obsessed with stage size because the depth of a stage limited the enlargement of the projection. With a shallow stage, you'd get a very small image, sometimes just an embarrassing rectangle above Neil's head. So to avoid a Spinal Tap moment, Howard would frame the screen with colored lights. Talk about resourceful. Our star continued to rise in '78. AFTK was generally well received, and Closer to the Heart even broke into the top 40 on UK radio. That was the year the Glasgow crowd blew us away, singing along on the chorus, the first time anything like that had ever happened to us. We played 2 nights at the Apollo there, a classic old theater built in 1927 with Corinthian columns and a severe rake on the stage. It was also really high, 15 feet 6 inches high to be precise, so that if you stood at the edge, you almost got vertigo. At face level opposite, there was a balcony that had been built to bounce up and down, and I can tell you, those Glaswegians knew it. Many bands who played that place have testified that when the crowd put the bouncy balcony to the test, trampolining it with all their might, you stood there in fear that it would surely collapse. The great advantage of playing 2 nights in the same venue is that the crew doesn't have to pack up and load out after the first show, giving them a night off and us a rare opportunity to unwind with them. So it was on a February night in Manchester in 1978 that we convened in the bar of the Piccadilly Hotel. For a while, Alex had not been very happy. His second son, Adrian, had been born the year before, and he was missing home big time. Out of the blue, he challenged our stage manager, Lurch, a towering man with a tough constitution, to a cognac drinking contest. Now, cognac, usually around 40% alcohol, is for sipping. No one in their right mind knocks it back in shots, but I think I counted a dozen rounds. Soon words were slurred, voice levels rose, and when a clearly plastered Alex triumphantly slammed yet another glass on the table, he shattered it. I looked at Liam and Howard and said, "You better get him to his room." So they put their arms around him and suggested it was time for bed, not least because we had another gig to do the following night. Those of us remaining in the bar had a laugh about it, then decided enough was enough for us too. And as we were waiting for the elevator, the doors opened and out flew Alex, lying prone on a room service cart. Cue more lunatic laughter, and once again Liam and Hearns rounded him up and escorted him to his room next to mine. Sitting on my bed, I could hear shunting and crashing through the walls like he was moving furniture around. I then heard him yelling out to the street, "Hey England, you guys are stupid. You're all living 1,000 years ago. Hey you, can you hear me?" I opened my window and leaning out said, "Works, buddy, go to sleep now. It's late." "Dirk," he said, "can you believe this? These people are living 1,000 years ago." "Yeah, Lurksty, I know. But come on, close your window." I closed my own and began undressing, but he kept calling my name, and then I heard more smashing sounds. He had torn down the curtains and was soon leaning out his window again, tapping on my window with the metal curtain rod. "Dirk, Dirk, don't go. Open your window." Half dressed now, I pulled back my curtains when the pane cracked apart, showering my room and me with splinters of glass. I looked down to see a 3-inch triangular shard stuck in my tighty-whities, about an inch from my manhood. Gingerly, I removed it, then heard scuffling in the hallway and hubbub all over the hotel floor. I tiptoed over broken glass to the door and looked through the peephole in time to get a fisheye view of a nearly undressed Alex running down the hallway with Hearns and Liam after him. They were just hustling him back into his room when 2 security guys charged out of the elevator and banged on his door. He opened up, the curtain draped over him like a gauzy toga, obstinately denying he had been making a disturbance. He slurred, "Well, I just don't give a," and spat on one of them. As we all cringed, mortified, Hearns did his best to placate them, earnestly apologizing and promising to sort it all out. He urged them to talk it over in my room, but when I opened the door, there for all to see was the glass strewn across the carpet. Somehow, Hearns got them down to the manager's office, reassuring them of our normally upstanding character and promising to pay for the damages, and saved us from being booted out in the middle of the night. I curled up under the blankets in that room, with no window, splinters everywhere, and fell asleep as the cool February air rushed in. The next day, poor Alex was embarrassed and humiliated, to put it mildly, even though we knew it was just one of those things that happens when a person's at breaking point. In a fragile state, we left to do our second show, and when we returned, he went up to each and every employee, shook their hand, and apologized. Perhaps because he was so sincere, they were more than cool about it, and even promised to welcome us back the next time we were in town. But the following morning, we still left with our tails between our legs. The test of endurance on the road continued until the end of May 1978. From a professional standpoint, things were bright, as by that time we were firmly established headliners, and for the first time, even making a little money. Uriah Heep, for whom we had opened 4 years earlier, was now opening for us. I say this with no sense of schadenfreude whatsoever, because they had always been perfectly good to us. But theirs was a cautionary tale, the dictionary definition of coming full circle, and a reminder of how quickly one's fortunes can rise and fall. It's just part of the circle of life on the road. Back home, Nancy and I were headed for our second wedding anniversary. I had been on the road for about 20 months, spending most of the rest in the studio. In real time, we had actually lived together as man and wife for less than 2, and at this point, there was still no end in sight. Still, we were happy enough on our independent paths, with Nancy ensconced at college, and me parachuting in and out of town according to the demands of our schedule makers, and somehow found the time to scout and put a down payment on our first house, a symbol of our commitment to each other, and an encouraging sign of the fruits of my labors. It was also where we had established some new traditions, starting with boisterous and increasingly extravagant Chrismukkah parties. As one of only a few families we knew who could afford a house, we threw ours open to an extended family of friends, fellow musicians, and several wayward Jewish pals who had never experienced Christmas before. I know it sounds heretical, but like me, they were all too used to watching enviously as Christmas was celebrated around the globe without us, while we ate Chinese takeaway and watched reruns of It's a Wonderful Life and Miracle on 34th Street. Basically, it was a case of, if you can't beat 'em, join 'em. For the longest time, my sister and brother and I agreed to keep from our mom just how vigorously we all enjoyed Christmas, and we hid those parties or dinners from her for many years. In our case, it was, don't mention the Christmas tree. Sometimes I'd slip by mentioning that we'd had Alan and Susie over for dinner on like December 26th, so she knew anyway. But we didn't want to rub it in her face. She'd usually be in Florida at Christmas time with Max anyway, which was convenient, but in time, we came clean. And you know what? She couldn't have cared less. She embraced it wholly, soon sitting every year at the long table with all the people she loved. People of all religions and ages. Actually, we ended up with more Jews there than those who came by the holiday honestly. But regardless, it showed how far she had come, from someone upset that I was hanging around in my teens with goyish of people to now being part of a mixed religion family. Far from seeing her grandchildren as mongrels, she loved them to pieces. All her old world ideas and prejudices, all her pains and fears, fell by the wayside. That summer, we once again booked time at Rockfield and began work on Hemispheres, with side one of another concept album beginning where the journey into that black hole known as Cygnus X1 on A Farewell to Kings had left off. Side 2 was equally challenging, with only 3 songs, one of them a complicated and shifting instrumental inspired by Alex's dreams, which he often related to us at the breakfast table. Now, the telling of dreams is something that will often put listeners right back to sleep, but his were spectacularly, epically, cinematically surreal. In one, he was steering an ocean liner down Young Street. Whenever he'd embark on another long, wild description at the breakfast table, Pratt would go, "Oh, somebody hit him. I'm getting a headache." But La Villa Strangito is an homage to Alex's dream, not inspired by any single one, but a journey through his subconscious mind and his overindulgence in marijuana, which meant anything goes, which is why the composition swings from one extreme to another. Earlier that year, I had engaged an independent and very experienced contractor to build me a custom synthesizer setup that would not only house my Oberheim 8 and my Mini Moga, but also let me trigger their sounds with my feet via several Moga Taurus bass pedals mounted below. A unique, unified, highly functional keyboard stand. Yeah, right. Not only was he late delivering it, but it was absurdly ginormous. Oh, and one other detail. It didn't work. I could play the syncs all right, but the foot pedals did nothing. Nada, zilch, zip. I had no way of knowing, of course, but what I was trying to invent was something that only came out a few years later. MIDI, or Musical Instrument Digital Interface, a system that allowed diverse pieces of electronic equipment to talk to and control one another. It was overambitious, I admit, but the doofus I hired had convinced me, at great expense I might add, that he could pull it off. Well, he couldn't, and I was left with a great white elephant on my hands. Fortunately, my trusty keyboard techie Jack Secret was on the spot. He and Rockfield's electronics maven, Otto, labored on it for days, with eventually a modicum of success. It was an important step towards becoming the world's smallest symphonic rock band. On stage to that point, I'd had to supply the bottom end with bass pedals whenever required to play guitar on my double neck, and I felt frustrated. I wanted the texture and musicality of so many tantalizing new sounds, but I was primarily a bassist. I much preferred to devote my feet to other instruments while concentrating on my one true love. We were still very much of a mind that we wouldn't put anything on a record that we couldn't reproduce live. A classic example is Closer to the Heart, in which Alex plays the first verse on his acoustic and then takes a break while Neil gently hammers out a melody on orchestra bells and I accompany him on bass pedals. It's pretty and adds a moment of suspense. But the main reason we composed it that way was to give Alex time to switch to his electric guitar and play the next verse with full-on power chords. The Hemisphere sessions were arduous, intense, and slow. We had arrived in Monmouth without any material written beforehand, so we had to hole up in a nearby farmhouse for a couple weeks and write the entire album before moving into Roxfield to record it. We had underestimated our own ambitions and ended up with a pretty complex concept album that would prove to be much more difficult to get on tape than we anticipated. We had always prided ourselves on playing whole songs in one take, live off the floor. Not unusual for many bands whose tunes were short and simple, but these more complex pieces were proving more than we could chew. The Hemisphere side was divided into bite-sized sections, and therefore easier to lay down in one go, even the parts in 13/8 time. But Strangito was a horse of a very different color. For days we tried to lay down all 10 minutes of that one in a single flawless take, before crying uncle and recording it in 3 parts that Terry then spliced together. It took us more than 10 days to record those bed tracks and overdubs, and then to mix them down, meaning by one calculation that we spent more time on that one song than the entire Fly-By-Night album. We took advantage again of being able to record outdoors for the trees and parts of Hemispheres, but I don't think the Welsh sun shone more than twice that entire summer. As the work piled up and we all grew beards, despite a brief conjugal visit by Nancy, the bloom of being in a boys' club started to come off the rose. Everything took longer than expected. We ran out of time in Wales and had to use the mixing sessions we had set aside at Advision in London to finish recording vocals and guitars. The vocal sessions in particular were the most difficult of my career, and at one point I completely melted down. To give my throat a rest, I'd usually alternate recording time with Alex, but after he'd finished his solos, I had to sing virtually every day. That's when I realized I had made a serious mistake. Never having sung these songs in either rehearsal or concert before, I hadn't gauged if the melodies were in the best key for me or not. At the writing stage, I had worked out the melodies in a quiet hum or falsetto, assuming they would work. Not. The keys I had chosen were in between, meaning that if I sang in my speaking voice, it was too low and without power. But if I sang an octave higher in my patented Geddy Lee range, well, it was too high, even for Geddy Lee. I did not grasp this mistake until the red light was on, the tape was rolling, and I opened my mouth to sing. Prelude. I tried over and over again with force and precision above the heights of my vocal range. Frustrated to hear Terry say into the talkback over and over, "Sorry, Dirk, you're a little flat. Once more, please." Eventually, and the only time in my career that this has happened, I blew my lid and stormed out of the control room to walk it off on the streets of London, blaming everyone but myself. Why hadn't Terry noticed that? He's the damn producer. And when I returned to the control room, I was still in a huff. I sang again and again and again, stretching my chords for 2 weeks until I got what we needed. Man, it was torture. But I nailed it at last, and we tried to reset our brains for the mix. We took no time off between vocals and mixing to clear our heads, which was a mistake. Terry immediately had trouble with the mixes at AdVision. He didn't like what he heard coming out of the speakers. Every move he made, every EQ he added, felt like a struggle. And though we had been perfectly happy with the mixes he had done for A Farewell to Kings in the very same room, he started to lose faith. He was freaking out. One night, back at the hotel after another frustrating session, he suggested we take the tapes around to other mixing rooms in town to be sure the tracks we recorded at Rockfield were right and true. One of them was Trident Studios in Soho, with its legendary bespoke Trident A mixing console, terrific sounding LPs such as Ziggy Stardust, Elton John's first album with Your Song on it, some of the Beatles' White Album, Seps, The Song Remains the Same, Genesis' Nursery Crime, the Mahavishnu Orchestra's Birds of Fire, the Yes album, and countless others had either been recorded or mixed there. If ours sounded wrong in a room with such a pedigree, it had to be on us. Terry put up the tapes, and boom! Not only did it sound like the record we thought we had made, but we could also clearly hear what tweaks would make it sound even better. I was flabbergasted and very relieved, as was Terry, judging by the color coming back to his face. I'm sure he had been starting to doubt his ability to hear, but one listen in Trident, and all was right with the world again. No one could explain what hadn't worked for Hemispheres at AdVision, but one thing's for sure, we were lucky to have grabbed some rare and valuable time at Trident. Musicians, engineers, and producers will argue noon and night over which consoles are superior, analog or digital, or a hybrid of the two, NEV, API, SSL, and so on. But the Trident was truly among the best. Most important, it clearly suited the sound we went after for Hemispheres. It had a sweeter tone. There seemed to be more air around everything. It was easier to place the various instruments along the spectrum. It colored the sound in a pleasing way. The top end was sweet, while the mid-range was not overly aggressive, and the bottom was smooth. In short, it was musical. After all those months working in the UK, we threw an official playback party for ourselves and some pals, including some from Neil's days in the Carnaby Street souvenir shop. You know by now how much I hate final playbacks, but this time the record sounded awesome to me, different from anything we had done to date. I felt we had broken new ground, even if in the effort we had left some blood on the tracks. The intensity and the length of time we were away from home during those sessions took a chunk out of us, and in some ways, we'd never be quite the same. We vowed never to set ourselves up for such misery again. We became determined to be better prepared, writing and even doing rough demos before setting out to record, even deciding what key the song should be in. Hemispheres taught us the importance of the word pre-production. A touchstone for keeping ourselves sane, for instilling professionalism, while maintaining a balance of work and family. While we'd been away absorbed by all things Rush, our families were starting to pay the price. Alex was all too familiar with the guilt and longing caused by being an absent father, while Neil had barely been home that year for his daughter Selena, who had been born in April. They were both ahead of me in this department, though that would change soon enough. In the meantime, Nancy and I bought a second home, so that now we had one in town and one in the country. You could say that at 24, we were learning how to live the life of the new riches. In reality, we were far from rich, as a Porsche was my only possession of value, and least at that. Nonetheless, we were earning and starting to put away a bit of money while paying down 2 mortgages. Life was getting complicated, but we seemed to be handling it. Youthful ignorance sometimes works to one's advantage. Before going back on the road to promote Hemispheres, the band went into rehearsals. That may sound too commonplace a thing to be worth mentioning, but having compared notes with many other musicians over the years, I'm convinced that no one ever rehearsed more than we did. Our show had to be tickety-boo, or it simply wouldn't jibe. I've talked to other bands who rehearse 2 weeks, and then they're off on tour. The only other exception I can think of was when my pal Josh Homa told me that the band he put together in 2016 for the post-pop depression tour with Iggy Pop rehearsed for well over a month. It showed. The band was note perfect and incredibly tight. It's not like we enjoyed it. Well, Neil actually did, because he was such a perfectionist and suffered from a bit of stage fright. It settled his nerves knowing the songs inside and out. But for Alex and me, rehearsing was really boring. You play the same song over and 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 over again. And sometimes you're just doing it for the one band member who needs it. Syncing up my sequencers could be a nightmare for everyone else, I'm sure, but Alex drove Neil and me the craziest as we waited for him to get his sounds together. Whack the guitar, twiddle a knob, whack the guitar, twiddle a knob, whack the guitar, twiddle a knob. Save me, someone. So typically, we'd each rehearse on our own for 2 or 3 weeks until we knew our individual parts without having to think about them. Then we'd rehearse as a band on a soundstage for another month before several days of full dress rehearsals in our opening night's venue. To spare my voice at that stage, I'd still only sing the numbers where the guys depended on vocal cues. In later years, I started using a teleprompter because our shows were so long that I would sometimes forget lyrics, and when we began using props and set changes, it was better for everyone, both the band and the crew, to know exactly where we were in a song. Meanwhile, all the snippets of film footage we had been working on for months would invariably only be arriving in bits and bobs, sometimes not even in time for opening night. In the 2000s, our show was jam-packed with rear-screen footage, and we were traveling with a full video crew, so we'd have to do dress rehearsals just to get those cues right, too. Every song had its accompanying visuals. There was hardly a break from it, and when there was a break, live cameras projected us up behind. All that stuff had to be coordinated perfectly, or you'd risk a train wreck. For me, the toughest thing to prepare for a tour was the simultaneous performance of all the parts we had recorded separately. It was relatively easy to play our early songs strictly as we recorded them, but our later rhythmical and lyrical complexities could be hell to play and sing at the same time. My rehearsal routine was to first learn my bass parts until I wasn't thinking about them anymore. Only when I could play them by sheer muscle memory could I attempt to sing the song. That's yet another reason Neil and I bonded so well. He appreciated that I had to learn the kind of multi-dexterous independence a drummer does, and his was mind-blowing. With one hand playing one rhythm, while the other hand was playing another, and each foot was doing its own thing too. Every limb of your body is thinking as an individual, detached but in sync. When asked once to describe his job, he replied, "It's like running a marathon while doing math equations." Amen, Bubba. Looked at mathematically, the disparate beats might seem to have no business in the same bar, but Neil's genius was making them fit. And while it took brilliance to think those rhythms up, it was rigor, discipline, and rehearsal, as well as rehearsal, oh yes, and also rehearsal that pulled them off. But muscle memory has its downside. After performing a song hundreds of times, a part of you gets bored and your mind starts to drift. I know it sounds impossible, but I could be in the middle of a song, working every limb on pedals, bass, and keyboards, with pyro blasting and lasers swirling all around me and the audience going berserk, while my mind was somewhere else thinking about some other. One time in Las Vegas, on our R30 tour, Unconsciously triggered, no doubt, by the drawing machines I had set up behind me in the place of amp stacks, I found myself worrying, in full flight of Tom Sawyer, how we'd get my son Jules' laundry done before leaving town the next day. Another time in Brazil during intermission, I had been bidding at an online auction on a piece of baseball memorabilia and spent half of our second set upset that I hadn't bid enough. It's like you're driving a car and make a left-hand turn, then all of a sudden you're like, did I just make that turn? Did I even signal? Losing yourself in a song is not that dangerous, but performing half on autoplay will send the show right off the rails, so you start to invent rhythmical changes to the song, little stimuli to keep yourself alert. Speaking of baseball, our Hemispheres tour was also the time when my obsession with the game really took hold. I had left sports behind for years, but reconnected in the late 70s, on tour for a farewell to Kings and Hemispheres. Waking up way past noon, my daily ritual was to beg the nice lady from room service to send me up anything resembling breakfast, which I'd eat in front of the TV. It was the dawn of cable, the only things on at that time of day being soaps, infomercials, old movies, quiz shows, and courtesy of the two superstations, WGN Chicago and TBS Atlanta, baseball. I'd watch the Cubs or the Braves, and wouldn't you know it about me, got so hooked that I made it a point on any day off, in whatever town we were, to go watch a game in the local ball yard. Major or minor league, it became my great escape from the touring world, a hedge against boredom, and a revelation to me. I was besotted. I became so deeply enthralled by the game, its history, its strategies and stats, its personalities, that the minute I got back to Toronto on a break, I signed up for season tickets for the Blue Jays. They had only entered the Major League in 1977, so it was still easy to get good seats then, and after that, there was no looking back. Between October 78 and June 79, we trundled around the globe, playing around 135 gigs, many of them with the same opening bands as before, as well as the Pat Travers Band, Judas Priest, Golden Earring, and April Wine. We played so many shows, on one stretch, 23 in 24 days, traveling overnight from one to the next, that I'm sorry to say they're now a blur in the haze of whatever booze we consumed to get ourselves through. We had little choice but to tour abroad constantly. It was so hard in those days for Canadian artists to enjoy cross-border recognition that many like Joni Mitchell, Neil Young, Leonard Cohen, and the band fully decamped to the USA. A few like Gordon Lightfoot, April Wine, The Guess Who, and Bachman-Turner Overdrive were somehow able to score international hits while sticking resolutely to home. But without the benefit of top 40 radio exposure, we had to play countless gigs south of the border, opening for whoever we could, trying to build a fan base in the Midwest that we hoped would expand to the coast by word of mouth. Most of the other Canadian bands I can think of didn't have the will, the connections, or the good fortune, not to mention Ray's dogged determination to keep us working in the States to succeed that way. It's not that as a nation we lack talent. Part of what's always limited so many Canadian acts is the harsh geographic reality. Ours is a vast country with a proportionally tiny population, mostly in our 6 or 7 cities, huddled along the 49th parallel. You could drive for days between them before you'd find a venue bigger than the local community hockey rink. While by contrast, I was always amazed by the number of Americans who lived and worked in sprawling suburbs or smaller towns, filling out the in-betweens. There we'd play rural towns that were barely on the map, but had 10,000-seat arenas. Musically speaking, that meant Canada was a nation of regional enterprise, without the economic concentration or the flag-waving fervor to grow bigger. Before the 70s, Canadian media suffered from small country mentality, lacking cross-country awareness and a sense of national pride. Radio stations favored music that was big elsewhere. taking notice of the scant few homegrown bands who had won approval abroad, but depriving others of the oxygen they needed to grow in the first place. To rescue Canadian artists from this vicious cycle, our government decided it had to build a cultural wall between us and the States by imposing Canadian content regulations on domestic radio and television operators. As of 1971, a minimum of 25% of all music played on our stations had to be Canadian content, or CanCon for short, as defined under the MAPLE system. The acronym stood for 4 criteria of Canadianness, at least 2 of which you had to meet in order to qualify. M. Is the music written by a Canadian? A. Is the artist Canadian? M. Is the performance recorded or performed live in Canada? L. Are the lyrics written by a Canadian? It was a way of breaking the chokehold American media had on us, legally defining what constituted a Canadian artist, and then mandating radio stations to play us more often. Yay! By qualifying in all 4 categories, we now knew we really were Canadian. But before you go all NME on me and say how ironic it is that we 3 Ayn Rand-style, laissez-faire capitalists welcome nanny-state intervention, may I remind you that it was the American station, WMMS, that gave us our first real leg up. And only as our success rose abroad were Canadian stations suddenly less reluctant to give us a spin, which then helped us find a wider audience in our home and native land. Well, that's the end of chapter 15. Let me know what you thought of this chapter in the comments below. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Till then, rock on.